Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I'm your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. You can find show notes, how to contact me, sign up for our mailing list, and how to support the History of the Papacy by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Two great ways to support the History of the Papacy are leaving your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. And another really great way to support the History of the Papacy is by going and joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. Your support on Patreon goes a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you'll be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William B., Brian, Christina, Sarah, William H., Augustus, Keanu, and Judy at the Alexandria level. We have Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, Steve, and Sean, all of whom are magnificent at the Constantinople level and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Alex the Great, Amma the Great, Frederick the Great, and Geoffrey the Great. In the last episode, we gave background on the history of the highly influential and controversial papal text of the Syllabus of Errors. We also began looking at the points made in the actual texts. Let's dive back into the categories and the points covered in the Syllabus of Errors, then discuss some of the fallout from this one-of-a-kind document. Number 7, Category 7, Errors Concerning Natural and Christian Ethics. Point number 56, moral laws do not stand in need of the divine sanction, and it is not at all necessary that human laws should be made conformable to the laws of nature and receive their power binding from God. 57, the science of philosophical things and morals and also civil laws may and ought to keep aloof from the divine and ecclesiastical authority. Then 63, it is lawful to refuse obedience to legitimate princes and even to rebel against them. That one is all over the place because in a way they're saying that you have to serve 2 masters in a way. A person has to be completely supportive of the church, but they also have to be completely supportive of their secular prince, or I guess in the case of a democracy, the democratically elected government. You can't rebel against your government, just like you can't rebel against the church. And what I'm thinking is that a properly ordained by God Catholic prince is what they're really looking for, and that's the ideal setup. Category 8 is really interesting, and that's errors concerning Christian marriage. And there's 3 points that I think are worth talking about, and I'll read them. The error that the sacrament of marriage is only a something accessory to the contract and separate from it, and the sacrament itself consists in the nuptial benediction alone. 67, by the law of nature, the marriage tie is not indissoluble, and in many cases, divorce properly so called may be decreed by the civil authority. And then 68, the church has not the power of establishing determined expeditements of marriage, but such a power belongs to the civil authority by which existing impediments are to be removed. And that one, it's saying that marriage is inextricably linked with the church, and that sacramental marriage can be combined with civil marriage, but sacramental marriage is more important than civil marriage, that divorce is no bueno or no good in any way, and that the civil authority can't place any sort of impediments against sacramental marriage. You can obviously see where this is all going in the modern era and how that would develop. It's just the church has prohibitions against all sorts of different combinations of marriage thereof, but you can obviously see where this one could be a major conflict back in the 1860s, and then that would continue all throughout the 20th and into the 21st century. Now we get into our penultimate category, that of category 9, errors regarding the civil power of the sovereign pontiff. I pointed out 2 of the theses here. 75, the children of the Christian and Catholic Church are divided amongst themselves about the compatibility of the temporal with the spiritual power. And then 76, the abolition of the temporal power of which the Apostolic See is possessed would contribute in the greatest degree to the liberty and prosperity of the Church. This goes back to the idea that if the church had no temporal power and no say in any of the civil societies and the civil government, that the church could just do church stuff and be perfectly fine. It would be honestly much better for everybody if the church basically just stayed in its lane and not be involved in temporal power. Obviously that the Pope is not going to be okay with that one, and we can really leave that at that. Go back, listen to all the episodes, and you'll see why that's an error. And then our final error is errors having reference to modern liberalism. Before we go too far, I guess we should say what liberalism means. And you got to pull yourself out of the 20th and the late 20th century, 21st century of liberals. It's not exactly that. It's really what our modern, especially in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, France, and many other countries, the idea of classical liberalism, of life, liberty, property rights being protected by the government, negative rights that what the government's not allowed to do to you, free market economies, but also Marxist economies pretty much divorced from the traditional medieval idea of economies being tied with the church. All of that rolled up into what they called modern liberalism, what you could really call is what we think of as what's the building blocks of a good society are. That's what the church is saying is an error. And some of those points are like point 77. In the present day, it is no longer expedient that the Catholic religion should be held as the only religion of the state to the exclusion of all other forms of worship. It's an error to the Catholic Church that a country would say that other religions can practice their religion freely, or that there's any other state religion besides exclusively Roman Catholicism as the state religion. 78, hence, it has been wisely decided by law in some Catholic countries that persons coming to reside therein shall enjoy the public exercise of their own particular religion. In the countries that were traditionally Catholic countries in South America, really France, you could say, Spain, Portugal, Italy, the church was scandalized that there would be immigrants there who practiced their own religion. And that was a major error to them that would be allowed. Point 79, moreover, it is false that the civil liberty of every form of worship and the full power given to all of overtly and publicly manifesting any opinions whatsoever and thoughts conduce more easily to corrupt the morals and the minds of the people and to propagate the pest of indifferentism. Let your mind run wild with that one, as it fits in with the point I previously mentioned. Then the last one of all of them, point 80, The Roman Pontiff, the error that the Roman Pontiff can and ought to reconcile himself and come to terms with progress, liberalism, and modern society. That's a big time error, and Pius IX is having nothing to do with that. I'd like to share some of my overall thoughts with that. Depending on when and where you were born, some of the points in the syllabus might drive different thoughts on the matter. If you were born in the 1800s and contemporary to the syllabus of errors in a place like rural Italy, you'd be like right on with all of those. You're an aristocrat in the United Kingdom at that point, then you're feeling very differently from that. I would say most religious people today, Roman Catholics, I'm not going to speak for them, but I would have to imagine a bunch of them today would have problems with some of these points, and maybe others, Roman Catholics, would love these points. You get very different opinions, like I said, depending on time and place. As an American, a citizen of the United States myself, some of these points are so anathema, it's hard to even say them. It's shocking to say them as errors. They're basic foundations of our society. As a man of the 21st century, other points are shocking or either and almost abhorrent for other reasons. Steve here again. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Josh Cohen's Eyewitness History and many other great shows. Go to Parthenon Podcast to learn more. And now, here is a quick word from our sponsors. Many of these points were shots against the liberalism of places like the United States. Other points were against the French, the burgeoning Italian state, the burgeoning German states, the Russians, the Protestants. Individual points that were directed either scattershot across the whole world or against certain specific peoples and groups. That being said, a lot of these points would be seen as errors even in our globalized society today in certain places and among certain people. So I don't want to draw too many of my own opinions on these points, but I think you can kind of get the drift of where I'm coming from. There's a lot of errors, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about these errors as well. So definitely send in your comments on them. I think we can all agree, though, based on what we've learned throughout this series, you can see that certain points would have rung home very true with Catholics living in secularizing or very Protestant countries. And I think that there's definitely a lot for us to think about in this list of so-called errors. Let's talk about the reaction at the time in the 1860s to the syllabus of errors. There was a quite positive reaction within the Roman Catholic Church, and it really shows how much the ultramontane position had completely taken over the Catholic hierarchy into the clergy and then into the laity. There was virtually no backlash from inside of the church. Even some of the supportive clergy and bishops thought some of the points in the syllabus were a little over the top, and some felt that they had to explain away or at least temper the syllabus, and we'll talk about some specific examples of that in just a minute or two. Groups like the conciliarists that we'll talk about in future episodes, the errors of all the isms like Gallicanism, Jansenisms, etc., they were not big fans of the syllabus. But by the 1860s, these groups had been very much pushed to the margins of the church. That being said, there was a huge amount of backlash from outside of the church, particularly in Britain and in the United States. The United States was built on Enlightenment and classical liberal ideals. Britain embraced many of these concepts as well. I mean, many of these concepts were invented in Britain or in France. Both the United States and Britain had strong anti-papal tendencies, which didn't help as well. They had a natural distrust of the papacy, and within really, I guess in Britain, you'd call it the aristocracy. In the United States, you might say in the upper crust, but even into the more Anglo parts of American society, the Whigs and the nativists and the know-nothings. Both countries had large influxes of Catholics, which made for even more conflict, especially over a document that was so anathema to the core of, say, the United States or British society. But then there's all these immigrants from Ireland, from Italy, from German Catholics coming in they're pretty okay with all of this. They're having conflicts across the board. I'd like to share a little bit about a letter that Cardinal John Newman wrote called A Letter Addressed to the Duke of Norfolk on occasion of Mr. Gladstone's recent expostulation. This is a letter written to the Duke of Norfolk, and he was the symbolic leader of Catholics in England, but the symbolic secular leader, non-Catholic hierarchical leader. Like he wasn't in any way associated with the hierarchy, being a clergy or a bishop, but he was the Duke of Norfolk was always seen to be the symbolic leader of English Catholics, going back all the way to the Reformation. This letter was not written directly as a correspondence to the actual Duke, Henry Fitzalan Howard. He was only 17 years old at the time, and he was making the grand tour, as they say. And so it was written to the symbolic. It was written to the office, not the office holder. The letter's real intended audience was the political and educated class in Britain, particularly influential political leaders like William Gladstone. He was the leader of the opposition party at the time in Britain. He would be in and out of the highest levels of government in Britain until the end of the 19th century. More importantly, he had a scathing attack on the syllabus, so much so that somebody like Cardinal Newman, who we will get into in his very own episode, felt that he had to respond to the criticisms of somebody like Lord Gladstone. This letter to the Duke of Norfolk is what people might call pope-splaining. Newman said that the syllabus of errors, it had no dogmatic force. It was written by some nobody who really didn't have any broad support within the church. Pretty much what Newman was trying to say was, nothing to see here. The syllabus doesn't really mean what it says. Even if it did, it's no biggie. Let's just go on. Here's a little, I'm going to read a slightly long excerpt from Newman's letter. Quote, I have spoken of the causes intrinsic to the syllabus, which have led to misunderstandings about it. As to external, I can be no judge myself as to what Catholics who have means of knowing are very decided in declaring the tremendous power of the secret societies. It is enough to have suggested here how a widespread organization like theirs might malign and frustrate the most beneficial acts of the Pope. One matter I had information of myself from Rome at the time was when the syllabus had been published, before there was yet time to ascertain how it would be taken by the world at large. Now, the Rock of St. Peter on its summit enjoys a pure and serene atmosphere, but there is a great deal of Roman malaria at the foot of it. While the Holy Father was in great earnestness and charity addressing the Catholic world by his cardinal minister, there were circles of light-minded men in his city who were laying bets with each other whether the syllabus would make a row in Europe or not. Of course, it was in the interest of those who betted on the affirmative side to represent the Pope's act to the greatest disadvantage. And it was very easy to kindle a flame in the mass of English and other visitors at Rome, which, with very little nursing, was soon strong enough to take care of itself. unquote. Newman was, in a way, trying to play both ends of the field in the greatest controversy caused by this publication of the Syllabus. Yeah, the Pope was right. It was the people who put the whole thing together who were wrong. It's trying to have your cake, eat it too. I mean, you can think of any other saying. Newman's trying to run that line. Yeah, it's a little problematic, but the intention was good. Sure, the Pope's definitely correct on all things, but there's a lot of people in the apparatus, things could get a little garbled and the message could get a little garbled and a little lost in translation. What Newman really gets very extremely close to saying is referring to the Curia and all the machinery that operates underneath the Pope as the swamp. To use another idiom of our era, the deep state, you call it what you will. That's what he's trying to get to. Yeah, the Pope is right on the money. It's all these other guys who screwed it all up and didn't get across what the Pope was really trying to say, or even what the Pope was really saying. Even if that was problematic, he really isn't wrong if you think about it in a certain way. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. The general reaction from Ultramontane Catholics, there was a degree of embarrassment with the syllabus. Yeah, the Pope's all right. The Ultramontane position's okay. The Catholic Church is correct in all things theologically, but there's some bad seeds with some bad takes or interpretations on what's going on. There's a little section at the end of the text about the persecution of Catholics in Prussia, and a lot had to do with the politics and the situation around German unification, which was happening at around the same time as Italian unification. It was a really messy process of German unification, and it really could be a series in and of itself. And if this series wasn't running super long already, much longer than I ever thought it would go, I would get in somebody to talk about German unification. And at this point, if you want to hear it, let me know and maybe we'll try and make that happen. In this last section as well, Pope Pius was really ready to take shots at all comers. So even though we haven't directly addressed German unification, we've dipped in and out of the theological issues and controversies that were coming out of particularly Northern Protestant Germany and Northern Europe at that time. And as we've come to the conclusion of this series, we'll see the rest of the story of Catholics and Protestants in Northern Germany and these areas that and by some degree rejected Ultramontanism. So in conclusion, the Syllabus of Errors and Quanta Cura and the announcement of the launching of a new ecumenical council, Vatican I, were all 110% planned as a way for the Catholic Church and Pope Pius IX to build up a bulwark against what they saw as the failings and errors of modern society in the 1800s. All of these things were orchestrated to make a stand. It's hard to say what Pius IX's actual place was in all of this. Did he himself orchestrate it? Was he and what we might call the big idea man? Was he just the face of the organization? Was he a puppet for other forces? It's probably a yes and a no to all of the above. Understanding at least a bit about the Syllabus of Errors and the mindset behind it will give you a much clearer perspective on what happened at the Monumental Council of Vatican I. This will really lead us into the final episodes of this series where we hammer out the places of some of the major players who would come into Vatican I, and then Vatican I as a council itself. We'll leave things at that for today. I really thank you for joining me, and I would really like to take a moment for a quick appeal. Tell a friend about the show. Tell a few friends. Your word of mouth does more to let people know about the History of the Papacy podcast than any other way. And any other way you choose to support this show is always appreciated. So I thank you for listening. And if you have any questions or comments, especially as we're getting closer to the end of this series, I would love to hear what you think about this series. And I will definitely share that in an episode. Send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. And with that, I will talk to you next time.